Moderated by Maria Cino, old dear friend. The panel is on fixing a broken political system. You think?
We're going to find out.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the second day of New York University's Inside Politics. The first day was very, very exciting, and I can assure you, with I think you'll find fixing the broken political system very, very inspirational and thought-provoking. And to make that happen is a very distinguished group of panelists, which you've all met yesterday. So I don't know that I can say anything different, except I'm very, very happy to have Eugene, very, very well-known, becoming more well-known, especially after last night, we won't talk about that, journalist and White House correspondent for Political. Thank you very much. Pat, what can I say? Pat has taken, I remember one of my calls, you know, for those of you who are women, we sometimes over-prepare for panels, and maybe really over-prepare, so I won't ask Pat to tell you how many times we've talked. But Professor Extraordinaire of Political Science at New York University, thank you. Bettina, Inclán, 20-some years of experience in communications, both with legislative and private sector. But more importantly, she has like the best job outside of politics as the communications, overseeing the communications internally, externally for NASA. I mean, what's better than space? If you can't be an astronaut, why not head up communications? So thank you for being here. And my good friend Doug Thornell, I mean, this guy has more facts and figures, and I have to have about X number of years over him, but he has more facts and figures and has worked on numerous campaigns, well-known, and has working now for one of the, I think, the premier, and I can say this as a Republican, probably one of the best Democratic public affairs firms, but also does bipartisan communications, but one of the best firms in Washington, D.C., and happy to say that he'll be heading that up next year. So thank you all for being here. We are going to talk about fixing a broken political system. And I think the mayor actually set this up very, very nicely. How ironic that today we're discussing democracy in its birthplace in Greece, sitting in democracy's heart while talking about its health in the United States. In the past, and I think in the future, I hope, America proves that democracy's strength grows when it's threatened from enemies on the outside. But the battles that threaten us come from within, between opposing factions that all enjoy freedom of speech. With freedom of speech comes social responsibility, and we must remember that, to protect one another while arguing with one another. On election night, last Tuesday, Tim Ryan's concession speech is a great example of merging our right to speak with our obligation to follow democracy. So we couldn't get Tim to come to Greece. We're going to try that next time. But we do have a short video. We're going to see how well our technology works. So if I can ask for the video, we've taken a couple of minutes out of his concession speech for you all to hear. And I think that that will really set us up for the topics that we're about to talk about. So if I can turn it over to the technicians, which is not me.
We have too much hate. We have too much anger. There's way too much fear. There's way too much division. And that we need more love. We need more compassion. We need more concern for each other. There's important things. We need forgiveness. We need grace. We need reconciliation. We do have to leave the age of stupidity behind us. I have the privilege to concede this race to J.D. Vance, because the way this country operates is that when you lose an election, you concede. And you respect the will of the people, right? We can't have a system where if you win, it's a legitimate election, and if you lose, someone stole it. That is not how we can move forward in the United States. And I am concerned that this country as we move forward, it may get worse before it gets better. But we need good people who are going to honor the institutions of this country that have brought us to this point. And we have an idea and an understanding that the one thing we know for sure, is that our kids and our grandkids are going to live together. We're going to live together. We know that. And the question is, what kind of country are they going to live in?
So I think that says a lot for how it should be done. And I think many of us would hope that that's the route that we're going to be going into the future. But today, discussing the political systems and whether or not it's broken, I thought we're just going to start with this question right off the bat. And over the last several years, there's been an increasing number of articles, studies, op-eds, suggesting that our political system is broken, including an article late last year in the Time magazine, "Think the system is broken? You're not alone." So I'd like to kick it off with all of you on the panel and just ask you, do you think that the U.S. political system is broken? As a bonus, I might add, I've informed Lynn and Ellen that if everyone says it's not broken, we can go back outside and have some some more coffee and cookies. But with that, if I could start with Eugene, and we'll just go down. But do you think that the political system is broken? And if you think the political system is broken, maybe just kind of give an example as to why you think that it is in fact broken.
I think that I was talking to somebody about this recently and whether or not they thought the political system was broken. And something that they brought up is that systems typically continue to operate in the way in which they were created and who they were created for. And I think the reason that we all feel like our political system is broken is because it's chaotic. And we feel like there's no way to, as Tamara was saying, come together. But what the person said, and I tend to agree, is that maybe it's not broken, but it's set up and it's working the exact way that it was supposed to. The issue is that the country looks different, the way that we talk about things is different, the issues that we spend a lot of time on look different, and so that is why it feels broken. But it is working in the way that the Constitution and all, and it was let out. But when you have a country in which women have more power than ever, people of color, other marginalized communities have more power than they've ever had before, that's why we realize that something's not working here. That if it was written for people that look a lot like my husband, a white man in America, then the people that look like me feel like, okay, well, this table, this room wasn't built for me. And so the question that I think that all of us, especially all of us that have influence and power and all of those kinds of things, should be asking and working to answer is, what are the ways in which we make our political system work for everybody, right? Because it's not a question of whether or not we're going to be able to change the Constitution. That's not going to happen. I don't know if you guys look at the numbers. It's not going to change. But what we can do is continue to have these conversations. When we went to the Acropolis on Saturday, we were walking around and snuck behind a tour guide. We didn't pay for our own. We just snuck on someone else's tour for a little bit. And one of the things that he was saying really struck me, and he was talking about the space, and that at one point, this was a place where science and superstition, reason and religion lived together, where people were in their groups having intense debate and conversations, and then they would go and have wine and dance all night together. And I think that really struck me, especially as you're walking around this beautiful area, thinking about the folks that really birthed democracy in the way that we all think about it. And if at that time they were able to do it, it feels like something that we can eventually get back to, but it's going to be painful and hard.
There we go. Okay. No, really, you would think. I think it depends on, the answer to the question of whether the system is broken depends a little bit on your perspective. And I think Eugene raises a good point, which is the system any more broken than it was before 1919 when women couldn't vote? or before 1964, when a lot of black people couldn't vote, by systematic exclusion, by laws and rules that made that impossible. And so one thing I always like to try to think about when thinking about this general question is to sort of put this in historical perspective and say, in many ways, we're still much better off now than we were before then in terms of a system that is truly representative, that truly is democratic with a small d. And I think those changes are part of the reason why this system can feel broken to those of us living in the present. You know, we have a tremendous demographic change in the United States along the lines of race and ethnicity. And we all know how rapidly that is having an impact on the makeup of our population. And it's also happening at the same time where there's been a hollowing out of a lot of American communities, particularly those that have been impacted by automation and outsourcing of jobs. And at the same time, there's been a real decline in social mobility. So the American dream, the idea that you would do better than your parents, which used to be the reality for about 90% of the population, now is more like a coin flip. That's what all the data tell us about that. So there's a lot of reasons why a system that, as Eugene said, was designed to exclude a big part of the population is groaning under the weight of trying to accommodate a new vision of democracy that I think we all in this room would agree is much better than the vision that our founders had, to be perfectly explicit. So I think the challenge then becomes how do the institutions and the norms of American democracy adapt to these changes? And I think they're doing so imperfectly. And Congressman Ryan mentioned a really important norm that, at least until last week, seemed to be under a fair amount of demonstrating some weakness, which was the simple act of conceding an election to the opponent that won more votes than you. And I think to the extent that we've got brittleness in the system reflected in those kinds of weakening norms, the system, if not broken, is certainly quite weak and straining under a big burden. And I think we don't really know how it's going to turn out, but it's helpful to have these conversations to sort of diagnose, figure out what's wrong, and hopefully point in the right direction.
Well, I agree with all our panelists. I would say that American democracy is not broken. I think America is the ultimate experiment. And every day we grow and become a better nation. I mentioned this yesterday a little bit, but I'll give a perspective, my personal perspective, and some data. To your point, we had an election, more people than ever participated, and people that won, wonderful, they're candidates, they're candidates, and now they're elected representatives or elects. And the ones that lost conceded, and we moved on. And I've been on both sides of the aisle of that, both sides of that, like winning and losing. But that is the wonderful thing about America. And a lot of times those people look for other opportunities to run, and ideas come up, and it inspires other ideas. So it's a wonderful and incredible system. And in perspective, you know, I am a child of a Cuban exile and a Mexican immigrant. And I got involved in politics because my grandfather was a political prisoner in Cuba for 13 years. And our entire life was about Cuban democracy and fighting for Cuban democracy. After I graduated from college, I went to go work for Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart of Miami, Florida, a huge defender of democracy. And it inspired me to continue that work. When I was 25, I became the executive director of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly. And my biggest job was trying to get more Hispanics across the country to be elected. And you talk about the American dream. Those people that I worked with that came to this country because their governments sucked, because there's no real democracy, because you don't trust the system, America is incredible. And the lives that a lot of my friends and I, we're grandparents and parents' wildest dreams, that what they could not achieve in their country because there is a corrupt and broken system, we can't do it here. And it is messy because now we have more people than ever participating in democracy, And that means more opinions than ever. And that makes, there's some people that feel very uncomfortable when their opinions are challenged, and some that are comfortable with open debate. I think our biggest challenge with people on this panel and the leaders that are listening to that is, how do you engage that? How do you have that balance of engaging different points of view without freaking out that people don't agree with you? And I think that that's what we have to do. And I think when people feel challenged, that doesn't always go well. And I think that we just, as leaders, have to encourage that debate, that new ideas aren't bad, they're good, and it makes us a stronger democracy.
So I don't think our democracy is broken. I don't think our political system is broken, but I think it probably needs a little therapy. I think if you think about just the last 20 years, it's been a pretty traumatic period of time for this country. If you start with Bush v. Gore, if you then go to 9/11, if you then go to the Iraq War, if you then go to Katrina, if you then go to the financial crisis and everything that happened around 2008, we've been in multiple wars. A lot has happened, I think, over the last 20 years to this country that has been traumatic for the folks in it, and it has. And I think you'll see this if you look at any polling of major institutions. There has been a real drop in trust in institutions that I think Americans used to have faith in: the Supreme Court, Congress to some degree, corporations, universities, media. Yeah, I mean, look, across the board, it's really across the board that you've seen this drop in faith. And I think what that has, and some of that is due to, errors that those institutions have made. Some of it is because individuals have exploited Americans who are feeling very vulnerable right now, and they've been able to create, in many ways, a system that helps them because there are no referees on the field anymore. So you can have a candidate, or you can have an elected official who goes out and says whatever they want, and there's no one who's there's no institution or organization that is a referee. And I think that is something that was not the case, at least when I started in politics. And then I also think the growth of social media, which in many ways has been good in terms of connecting folks and creating a huge, vibrant economy, a new economy, and new ways to communicate. But it also has resulted in, again, a vehicle for folks to say things that aren't checked. And so anyone can go out and say whatever they want, and there's no institution guarding what's true and what's false. And I think that is a real problem when people are getting a lot of their news and information now from Facebook and from Twitter, and oftentimes they are selecting who they want this information to come from, and a lot of that information isn't true. And so I think that because of everything that has happened over the last 20 years, I would say, and it's not that there haven't been other traumatic periods in this country's history. Obviously, we've had a civil war, World War I, World War II, the civil rights movement. I mean, but I just think of the last 20 years as being a time in which it's been a very traumatic period, and it has created an opening for people to take advantage of that trauma in a way that has not been good. But I mean, like the panelists said, we just had an election. 100 million plus people voted. There was no fraud. It was fair. And people won and lost, and the people who lost conceded. And it's messy in these campaigns. I know a lot of people, don't always like the negativity, but they generally, they create an opportunity for everyone to have a say. And so I think we just need to probably step back and admit to ourselves that, hey, maybe we need to, maybe we need a little therapy here, because I think there is this, it's imperfect, but it is still the best system, I believe, on the globe. And, but, you know, it probably needs a little tune-up.
And just to quickly add to, not only did we see the concessions, we also saw Americans largely bat away the people who the center of their campaign was that the last election was stolen, right? We saw the Arizona gubernatorial race in called today for Katie Dobbs, a very close race, still very close numbers, but Carrie Lake, who is someone who had already started to say that her election was, there was something fishy going on. And so what if you just listen to the American voters, they will often tell you what they want and the things that they care about. And one of the things I think that we should take away from a lot of the election results is that while there was a lot of angst, they don't like when us, all the people that are on the mics and running the country and elected officials are chaotic. And I think largely that the American voters on both sides of the aisle, all sides of the aisle, are over the chaos. And so this is an opportunity for the new elected officials across the country that on the Republican side and the Democratic side look more like the country than ever before to actually come together and listen to what the voters are telling us. Is they're sick of the chaos. They are not interested in extremism, and they seem to want this country to work, this experiment, as Bettina was saying, to actually work and work for more people.
Okay, that might be the hardest part of this job. You know, we've talked on several things, including media, which I'm going to get to, but maybe before we actually get to the impact of social media and print and TV, I don't know if they still use those terms, before we get there, just maybe hit on something, maybe, Eugene, that you talked about in a therapy, and I won't call it therapy, maybe it's more reforms. And it's not just the United States that believes that maybe the political system is broken, needs to be tweaked, or there needs to be reforms. Pew Research Center conducted a 4-nation survey in November and December of 2020 and released those results last year. And the headline was, many in the U.S., Western Europe say their political system need reform. And I'm wondering, when we look at what they found, roughly 66% of the adults in the U.S. and in France, as well as 50 in the UK, believed that the political systems needed some major changes, or at least some tweaking with regards to reforms. And thinking about those reforms, I'll throw out perhaps a couple that could possibly improve our political system. You know, there's been talk of change in state laws. As you probably all know, it's the states that actually not only conduct the state and local elections, but they also do the federal elections. There's been talk about redistricting, and we can all talk about the many, many articles that have written on redistricting. Public funding, as of late, they've even talked about not only term limits, but age limits. And then, of course, blanket primaries, a little bit more complicated. So maybe throwing that out, I'll specifically pick on maybe Doug and Pat, but love Eugene and Bettina to kind of join in. Are there some reforms that we are talking about that perhaps could provide that sense of that therapy, as Doug said, that would maybe help things be a little better for the U.S. Political system?
Okay, so this isn't real. I don't know if I would consider it a reform or not, and I do have some thoughts on that. But you know, I think if you look at the 535 members of Congress, for the most part, they are very much, they're siloed. The Democrats hang out with the Democrats, the Republicans hang out with the Republicans, and even within those caucuses, there are groups, and the relationships between the members of Congress are not what they used to be. And there was a time where Democrats and Republicans, yes, they would be fighting, and that was, that's always been there, right? The two parties always fight. But there was a level of respect and ability to, at the highest levels of the parties, to come together and try to get some things done and have a relationship. So what I would do, if I was Speaker of the House, I would create an exchange program between for every member, or maybe a buddy system, where a Republican and a Democrat are paired up, and each one has to go spend, a week in the other person's district. And we've seen this, I remember Beto O'Rourke did this with a Republican, I'm blanking on his name now, but they drove all across Texas, I guess, or something like that. And so what it would do, I think, is that it would create a awareness around what this person, what this other person in the other party, what their district's like, what are the challenges that they face. Maybe take them out of this shell of being just like a Republican member of Congress or a Democrat, but this is a person who has a family, who has constituents. It's a pretty easy thing to do. It doesn't need to be voted on. It's not going to cost anything. But I do think it would be a step in the right direction in terms of helping to sort of, I think, rebuild some of these relationships that don't exist in Congress. And so then there might be, then that sort of lends itself to maybe a little more trust, maybe less likelihood that either party tries to demonize the leaders in their party. I think, it's hard to cut a deal with President Obama when you run millions and millions of dollars saying he is the devil, right? And the same thing with Nancy Pelosi. And so, it makes it hard for the Republican leader on the other side there to cut a deal with someone that they've spent so much time demonizing. And I'm not saying Democrats don't do it either. I don't think it's to the same degree. But my only point is that I think there is some things that Congress can do to improve the prospects that it can be less toxic there. There will still be fights. It's fine to fight, right? I would hope, hopefully it can be done in more of a respectful way. But it would also, I think people, to Eugene's point, are just tired of the chaos and watching sort of the dysfunction. One of the reasons why Joe Biden was elected was because of restoring normalcy. And I think if they're watching Congress and they are seeing a bit more of a sort of a functional system, I think they're going to have more faith in the system and more faith in the people who are there.
Doug, that's really interesting. Before we maybe get to Pat, we were just talking about this last night. Long gone are the days, maybe we're showing a little bit of age. I don't know where you are, Ellen, because I can't see a darn thing. But, in the old days, Republicans, Democrats, in the evenings after votes would get together and actually share meals, perhaps some beverages, and actually talk about things other than politics, maybe more about family. And those days seem to be gone. And some of that we attribute it to the fact that, well, they don't have time to socialize anymore if all they're doing is raising money and running back to their districts or running to fundraisers. And I'm not a proponent of public financed campaigns, but I'm just wondering if that's something that has crept in the system now. That's all we do, especially members of Congress. You got 2 years to raise, $13 billion. Maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much, to get that done. You don't really have time to socialize. And I think the last time we saw that was probably Speaker Foley and Bob Michael, Minority Leader Michael. And then after that, maybe all bets were off. So, with regards to funding and the cost of campaigns. But I'll throw it back to you all, but wanted to, that's where age comes in, and having experienced, dinners with both sides of the aisle and a lot of fun and a lot of exchange, and you knew about each other's families. Now, not so much.
I'll be a little bit of a fly in the ointment here and suggest 3 things that might make our democracy better by reducing the amount of democracy. So see if I can bring you along here. So one is we vote too much. in the United States. There are too many elections. So in my home state of New York, we went to the polls 3 times this year, I believe, in part because there was a redistricting problem that led lots of districts to be drawn late, et cetera. We vote for an incredible number of offices in the United States, everything from dog catcher to president of the United States. Although when you ask Americans, they say they want to vote on all these things, including all the ballot measures, et cetera. But I think in the end, it's a bewildering and confusing and ultimately, I would say, overwhelming kind of experience for a lot of voters. And so one reform, counterintuitively, would be to figure out a way to simplify elections, to reduce the number of elected offices, to consolidate some power among elected offices, make them more appointed judges as opposed to elected judges. That would be one thing to think about. A second thing would be to make it easier for legislators from both parties to engage in closed-door bargaining and conversations that happen out of the sight and ears of voters. Those bargains can then be, yeah, exactly, right? Less democracy. But one of the things that we see happening in Congress is that there's actually very little real legislating done between the two parties, and much more of these sort of performative votes that are taking place just as symbols, right? To make the other party vote in a way that's going to make it uncomfortable for its base, et cetera. But when we think about how big policies get done, Reagan's 1986 tax reform, any real meaningful efforts to reduce the deficit, closing military bases, the kinds of things that require lots and lots of sacrifices on both sides that are difficult to stomach electorally. You have to do these things behind closed doors and present it as a fait accompli to voters, as opposed to having everybody debate it in a wide-scale arena. So I think more and more of those opportunities for legislators from both parties to engage in that kind of bargaining behind closed doors would be good. And then finally, I'm also going to say something that a lot of political scientists believe, which is that our parties are too weak. Okay? So we live in an era of intense partisanship. That is, if you tell me if you're a Democrat or Republican, I can tell you how you're going to vote and what you think and who you like, et cetera. But the parties themselves as institutions are probably at a historically low point in terms of their ability to do things like determine who gets nominated for important party positions and important party races, to serve as gatekeepers to keep the sane people in and the insane people out in terms of running for office. And so, again, counterintuitively, what I'm going to suggest is that one thing we could do is make it easier for parties, not candidates, not PACs, not individuals, but parties themselves to raise money. And that would give them more influence on things like who gets nominated, who wins primaries, et cetera, and also allow them to strengthen their party organizations that then make them into the real rich institutions that we need them to be to strengthen American democracy.
Thanks. I don't know if anybody wants to comment. If not, we'll keep moving on. So I told you I was going to go to the media next, but I can't help myself. I'm going to go off my questions, which is not something I usually do, as Ellen will tell you. And I know Michael Steele is here, so I'm going to ask this and kind of touching on what you just said, Pat. So I came up through the party system at the ripe old age of 12 years old, and I worked with local parties, state parties, and national parties. And that's really where I got my sea legs in my experience, and spent probably about 25 years in those particular committees. And in 2002, campaign finance, I believe, cut off the legs of the national parties, and to a degree, the state and local parties. I see Michael, I think, shaking his head. And of course, it's definitely state, but to some degree, the local parties. And in my mind, I can even relate to a phone call where the White House hung up on me as I was fighting why we shouldn't do this. I obviously lost that battle, and I'm proud to say that I did make a concession speech, but it wasn't anything I was happy about. I believe that when we went into campaign finance reforms, when we took the power, particularly of fundraising, away from the parties, I always thought as the parties, they were institutions, ongoing institutions, maybe the conscience, and maybe the guardrails. This is not a political commercial. I'll get to my point. But, after that, all bets were off. Guardrails down, institutions don't matter, and suddenly you had leadership PACs or 527s or wealthy individuals deciding, both on the Republican and the Democrat side, I don't need the party anymore, I can do this myself. So I'm just wondering, with, I'll call them rogue organizations, I don't know how wide and far this is going, but I'm not seeking any office or any confirmation, has that impacted and contributed to perhaps the behavior that we're seeing today? And Pat, I know you just talked about that, but it's something I felt. Michael, you can shout it out, but I know as a party chairman, not only on the national level, but on the state level, once the money starts drying up, you got no control over these rogue organizations out there. So with that, I'll throw it back to you all and just see what your thoughts. And I know, Bettina, you worked at a national organization, and that, certainly puts a little bit of more structure, so to speak.
Yes. I was thinking a lot because I know we talked a little bit about this, and I've had friends who have run for office, and they've commented like how hard it is for them to run for office because sometimes they're outspent, especially if they're a newcomer. But whatever, even if they were they did have a good amount of money, the IEs, these independent expenditures, would blow them out of the water. So I don't have a great solution because this has been decided at a Supreme Court level, and I don't think that's going to go away at any time soon. So
I just had to say it.
And there's probably people like Mr. Steele, Chairman Steele, who probably have some very strong opinions on all of this. The most I know as an operative is just trying to deal with the system and figuring it out as best you can. I don't control always the cards I am dealt. I just try to make the best of it. And it has been a challenging moment for a lot of people because these organizations sometimes define the candidate way before the candidate has an opportunity to define themselves, and it changes the playing field. But to be honest, I don't have great solutions other than, understandably working it to my advantage the best I can for my candidates and my the advocacy issues that I care about.
So I'm going to go to the audience here. Michael, I don't know if you would want to comment. And again, I don't know. I think you're right. I don't think we can change it. But it's certainly, over the last 22 years, I've watched what's happened. And maybe younger people could get into the system and do something about this.
Yeah, this was sort of a sweet spot for me.
You only have 3 minutes, but no.
Yeah. So settle in. We'll be here for a while. No, I think real quick on the money piece, it's important to understand that McCain-Feingold, which was the senatorial response to campaign finance, was a gross overreaction to something that really wasn't a problem. The institutions, the DNC and the RNC, were the central vehicles for the reception and distribution of campaign funds. What made that system work, which you don't have now, is that every 30 days we are required by federal law to disclose who our donors are. Every 30 days. So if you write me $1 million check to the party, in 30 days I'm going to put it in an FEC report. And everybody in the world is going to know that Eugene Daniels wrote the RNC $1 million check.
Well,
let that headline settle in for a while.
Checks for everybody. Look under your chair.
Right. So the other little interesting piece, when I became chairman, I inherited a lawsuit that we prosecuted all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had two suits in front of it. One was the RNC lawsuit that would overturn McCain-Feingold. Yeah. And the other one was Citizens United.
Yep.
And the Supreme Court decided to reject our lawsuit and accept Citizens United, and opened a Pandora's box of uncontrolled financial hell. Because now everybody can write a check for however much they want. They're not required to disclose where the money comes from, right, the amount of the dollars, so that the system that had the built-in checks and balances, albeit somewhat hanky every once in a while. It wasn't as clean as it probably could have been. There's some things around the edges you could have done. The court went far too far and took this sort of open-ended approach that has mired us now in this system where the financial responsibilities for candidates and party organization infrastructure no longer rests inside the parties. So donors don't give to the parties, they give to these IEs, they give to individual candidates directly to the extent that the law allows them to, but they have workarounds with that. And the parties have basically become shells of their former financial selves.
Well, now that I got that off my chest, I think the only thing I would add, and then we'll move on, I apologize, but I think it was an important point in our history where the institutions that also actually put together the organizations, grassroots organizations that the mayor talked about, some of that just doesn't exist anymore because there's no one to really fund it. And the only other thing I'd add, Michael, is that those organizations that set themselves up, they go away and then just rename themselves or rebrand themselves as something else. And organizations, as national parties or state parties, they have to continue. So there's a little bit more conscience there. So with that, I'll get us back on track.
Maria, can I just add one thing?
Yeah, sure, please.
So another thing I think to keep in mind is that if you look at the last 5 or 6 presidents, Bill Clinton was a party guy. George Bush was a party guy.
Absolutely.
Barack Obama ran outside of the party. Yeah. He came in, when he was elected, he started OFA, a sort of a parallel organization to the DNC. He was not the favorite of the Democratic Party when he ran. And Trump was Trump was an outsider to the party system. Yeah. And so it does matter who's, the president and who's, making these decisions about, how important and, how much influence and how much trust I'm going to put into these party systems when they didn't really trust him when they ran.
Good point.
So, I think it's also, now Biden's a party guy, and I think you see how, I think the DNC has become a stronger entity since he became, president. But it does matter, I think, quite a bit in terms of who is, in the White House and how much they actually trust, how much they invest in these parties.
No, I think that's an excellent point. And I think I almost said, I think parties do a better job of recruiting better candidates or pushing them up. In that case, maybe not so much, but and the Republicans, that did not prove, on the Senate side, did not prove to be the case. I can go on record as saying that. All right, I'm going to move us over a little bit to media, which is a sweet spot for, I think, everybody on this panel. And talk a little bit about, the impact of social media. You guys started talking a little bit about that. But, over the past couple of years, there seems to be an increased concern, and I come from the tech industry, over the harmful and manipulative interaction in some online spaces. And concern over the role of technology firms. Social media platforms have been drawing fire. Many of you might remember, particularly after the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, Congress actually summoned, I use that lightly, Facebook, Google, Twitter, several other, TikTok, to actually release their records with regards to misinformation around the 2020 elections. And there continues to be studies on this. The Wall Street Journal did a 5-piece series in late 2021 detailing some of this misinformation, targeted a little bit at Facebook. I'm just curious with regards to, given what you all, having communications backgrounds, given your expertise in communications, do you think that the social media has increased the polarization, fear, and violence, I use that loosely, in political campaigns? And is there anything that we can do about it or should do about it?
Yes, it has. I think, the thing about social media is that it has both kind of democratized information in a lot of good ways, right? It is where a lot of social movements have been born. It connects people across the world. You're able to mobilize and protest and, go wherever you want and have your freedom of speech and show out. And that is a good thing. It's a good thing that we're hearing from more voices than we ever have before. When you think about the Black Lives Matter movement, when you think about the Arab Spring, when you think about all these other places where people have risen up and said, we're not taking it anymore, a lot of that has happened, been organized and mobilized on social media. So that's probably a good thing for democracy. But at the same time, we saw and have seen a rise in hate speech online. We've seen a rise in the conspiracy theories, very dangerous movements like the QAnon movement that make actually zero sense, but that have continued and grown. And then you have politicians who use all of that to their advantage. And one of the things I think that's really fascinating about social media and political campaigns is that toward the end of the election, we did a bunch of different items, we call them, in Playbook, about people's final messages. And what we found was the final message that someone was giving on TV, on television, traditional media, and even on radio, which people apparently still use, and also in what they were doing online were very different, right? The 1 minute ad they put on social media was often angrier, was filled with more lies, was brought more chaos into the arena, whereas the ones on television were a little bit different than that, right? And I think what that tells you is that while social media has done a lot of good, at this point in 2022, what we often see is that because there are no guardrails, because the social media platforms don't see themselves as publishers, despite the fact that a lot of publishing occurs on the sites. There are no guardrails, and so as people, it makes it much more. It helps create the angst. It helps create silos across the country. You're able to follow and not follow whoever you want. You can curate your entire timeline to not have one Democrat or Republican speaking to you at all. You can curate it to not have one person of color speaking to you at all, not one woman on your timeline. And that is something that, if you, as all of us do, I think that more conversations among more people are good. That makes it dangerous. And then if that was it and it was just happening on social media, that would be one thing. But then you do see candidates, Donald Trump being one of them, who use that to their own selfish political advantage and then spread their own lies. And it's always interesting, when they brought, Facebook and Twitter and all those guys to Capitol Hill to talk about where the misinformation of 2020 came from. Like, it came from Donald Trump, right? Like, it's not like it wasn't hard to find where that happened. So it didn't start on social media, but because of the way social media works and the fact that there are no guardrails, it grew and continues to grow in certain sectors of the internet.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I want to echo the tension, and we're going to hear this throughout this panel, this conversation today, that one thing institutions do, that strong institutions do, is they act as gatekeepers. They provide guardrails, and that is they decide who's in, who's out, what voices should be amplified, what voices should be dampened, what candidates should run, what candidates should stay out. Over and over again, that's kind of the role. One of the big roles of institutions is to play the role of referee in deciding which voices, which participants are part of the conversation and which should not be. And social media is an example of the great democratization of media overall, in that there are now fewer gatekeepers, there are many more voices, and we've moved from what used to be kind of a vertical top-down media system. When I was in college, if you were a good liberal lefty, you would carry around this book called Manufacturing Consent. It was by Herman and Noam Chomsky, and it was basically a book that said the media is telling you what to think, and talked about how it was owned by all these corporations, and it kind of had a little bit of, you know, that good old conspiracy theory touch to it. But it actually, the point there is so much a contrast to today's media, where there's no consent to be manufactured, right? Because we've got so many different sources of media that coming to consent or consensus, which is would be wonderful if we could, is something that's very, very hard to do. Now we've moved from this top-down system to much more network kind of system. That means that individuals have the power to break through this media system in a way that was never true before. And that's wonderful for voices that have historically been excluded from conversations that were mediated by the media. But at the same time, it means that there's nobody who's really telling us, is this good information, is this bad information? Is this trustable, is this not? And so, you know, we're just in a real transition point where I think we're trying to figure out, and I don't have the answer to this, I'm just trying to diagnose, not solve the problem, where we are experiencing at full blast the advantages and disadvantages of a network system that has fewer guardrails, fewer gatekeepers, that is today's media system.
I'm going to give you a hammer.
You know, lots of great points in the conversations. I think I think all of us agree that there's extremes on both sides. And one of the we saw from polling is that both sides, all Americans, well, not all Americans, but there's many Americans, the majority of Americans feels there's a lot of extremism and there's a lot of division. And something that Chairman Steele said as we were talking about independent expenditures, it was like an overreaction of trying to fix something. And I think that is something we have to be careful on, in that as much as we want to ensure that there is honest and balanced information, it's also important like how that happens. Because I would say there's a lot of conservatives that feel that sometimes those people that are trying to provide, you know, truth checkers are often, we feel, are very biased, and that maybe their version is not exactly what we think. So there has to be a balance, because then there's people that are supposed to be nonpartisan that have a slant and then exclude people out of the conversation. So it's something that we're going to have to continue to work on and find a balance. But I know that there's many friends on the conservative side that feel that sometimes these so-called truth checkers are checking a very biased truth. So I also don't have a solution for that, but I think part of the solution is having lots of different sources of information. And as much as it's difficult for some people, we have to trust the voters, and we have to trust that adult people can act like adults and read and kind of make decisions for themselves, and that the best will always rise up. We're always going to have extremes. We're always going to have things, and it's not something new to our system. You know, we were just talking before, like there was yellow journalism back in the turn of the century. There was always people that moved the needle one way or another. So it's nothing new. We just have new forums.
Doug, you probably use social media, and especially running campaigns. I see more and more firms just popping up with regards to social media. So you probably have an interesting perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's obviously an important way to communicate with voters, but I think you also need to, you know, as a strategist on a campaign, as a you know, someone who, you know, whether you're a campaign manager or you're the candidate, I think you have to understand that oftentimes what is taking place, the conversation that's taking place on Twitter, doesn't normally reflect what the conversation is taking place in the real world. And so Twitter is, and Facebook and TikTok, they're important platforms to communicate on and send messages out on. And yes, oftentimes the messages you're sending out there are tailored for that audience, because sometimes you're not, there may be issues that you'll weigh in there, but you'll not necessarily weigh in, maybe on the stump or in your TV ads. And plus, when you think about who is on TikTok, generally younger voters, and so one of the things you are seeing in terms of how campaigns are communicating, not just political campaigns, but also campaigns by corporate brands, is they are now leaning into and using what are considered either micro or macro influencers, and they are these are folks who have 50,000 followers, 100,000 followers. Sometimes it's a lot more than that, but I know on a couple campaigns the last week or two, when we were trying to get folks to return their ballots, there were some campaigns who were using these micro influencers on campus to communicate on TikTok and the other platforms that they use to encourage folks to return their ballot. There's a lot of there's a lot of value. There's ways you can target voters that are much more. I would say you can micro-target voters on these platforms in a way that you can't when you're doing broadcast TV. But I would say when you're thinking about just in particular Twitter, I do think that you have to understand that this is not necessarily the voters' opinion in your district or in your state. And I think oftentimes there are some candidates and there are some politicians who run for office, and they are overly reliant on Twitter, and they believe that what they're hearing on Twitter actually reflects the part, where they live or where they're trying to represent, and it doesn't. And I think you can see, I think Joe Biden's campaign was a good example of a campaign that they used Twitter, but they also knew that the chatter on Twitter was not ultimately what was going to get them elected. And so they understood it for what it was worth. But they used it, and campaigns use it to communicate in very, I think in targeted ways. But you just can't believe that is all, ultimately the sentiment that voters have. It's a small universe of people who use Twitter regularly.
And to that point, media organizations also rely on Twitter probably a little too much. Not political, we do everything right. The rest of them, big issues. But I can't tell you the amount of times that an editor or someone has taken a tweet that's gotten, let's say, 5,000 retweets, which again, 5,000 retweets on a place where the vast majority of Americans don't even look at, is not actually that many people with 330 million people that live in America. And so what that tells you is not just the campaigns and political operatives use it a little too much, but so do we. And our reliance on, okay, this is what the chattering class is talking about, sure, but the chattering class can be wrong, and recently we've seen the chattering class be wrong quite a bit, and I include myself among the chattering class of people who have access to, who could hop on a plane and go to Georgia and talk to voters, but instead a lot of times we'll look on Twitter and see what the Georgia voters are retweeting. And I think what that tells you is these are the high propensity voters, people who are seeking out the information, sharing the information, and that doesn't tell you what the folks in the middle of the road, however small that road may be nowadays, are folks who are constantly hearing the ads on the ground, what they're thinking. And reporters have to do a much better job of not living on Twitter. Facebook, I think, can often be a much better barometer for how Americans are thinking. I think a lot more Americans are on Facebook. And I also don't use Facebook to do my stories, just to be clear. But the over-reliance on Twitter and social media, it's laziness. Being a reporter, being a media institution is a lot more expensive. The world is bigger than ever before. There's so much more information out there. There is a feed the beast mentality. There's a 24-hour news cycle in 1 hour, oftentimes it can feel. And I think unless media institutions, reporters, and political operatives and lawmakers figure out a way to pull out of this world that we've created in social media, where a lot of the ideas that are bouncing around are not bouncing around the kitchen tables around this country, we are not going to understand what's happening in this country. You look at 2016, one of the reasons basically everyone was surprised was because we were spending so much time on Twitter where the lead operatives on the GOP side were saying Donald Trump's never going to win the primary. And then they were also saying that during the general election, and obviously Democrats were saying the same thing. And when you went to a rally and talked to voters, and you met we were talking about this earlier this week, the Bernie Trump voter, when you realized there was something happening on the ground that we ended up missing, you would think that we would have changed, and we would have just, maybe Twitter's not the best goal, but we've started to rely on it more. And I think at the heart of that is laziness.
So I don't want you all to think I'm anti-journalist, but you guys are hitting on a really, I think, some really interesting points. And I'll give you a personal experience. In 2016, Pope Francis made a historical visit to the U.S., particularly in Washington, D.C., and was giving a major speech at the ballpark. And as I was walking out my office, and I looked at the three 65-inch TVs that we had in our office with no sound and just the news, it wasn't Pope Francis who was up there, it was Donald Trump. So the question I have, if anyone wants to comment, with regards to print and TV, again, aging myself, there's more pressure on media outlets, whether it's TV, radio, print. And we've seen more consolidations, much more emphasis on, profit. And what I've seen, and just want to confirm or not, with regards to fewer and fewer research investigative reporters that are out there. So many, including some of my fellow Republicans, would say that the media, because Trump had no money, he was putting no money into this, the media bolstered and really pumped up Donald Trump. So I'm not blaming them. We take full responsibility. But just kind of curious as to, has what's happening to the media being more profit-oriented, it contributed to maybe a decline in the political system to some degree?
Yes, 100% yes. I think the worst thing that has happened for American democracy is the lack of local newspapers. And you've seen the closing of those, and so what that means is people have to get their news from somewhere. And on the national level, again, not at Politico, we do everything correctly, but there is
high-paid reporter.
There is. We were talking about this earlier. The headlines being clickbaity, stories where we are chasing things that we, or the Chatham class are the only people that care about it. But at the same time, and it's a very chicken or egg situation here, is you have people who click on it, people who want to watch it. When watching an empty podium during 2016 where Trump may be coming soon, that was ridiculous. And I think largely most institutions and most media organizations realized that was a situation in which we messed up. One, because they never believed that he was going to win. And so they treated it as entertainment. Look at this is a trailer to what you're about to watch, and with the real movie that's coming in about an hour when he finally gets off the plane.
We looked at it as entertainment.
Yeah, exactly.
And cried.
And and I think one of the things that you are starting to see in some places, and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, is you have places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and we've always done this at Politico, is sending reporters into areas and living there. So like the New York Times, they actually stole some of my friends from Politico and sent them, and they just moved to Georgia to understand what was happening on the ground, instead of a national reporter like me flying in, staying there for a few days, and then flying out and thinking I know everything that there is to know about that state. And so there are ways that media organizations are trying to fix that, but it is 100% led to a lack of stories that really tell you how people are feeling. But also when we do a story on policy, it rarely hits that top 5 that's on the side in that little box, right? So it's not interesting, and so you have to. There's the American people, because of decisions made years ago, expect that the stories that they read are going to be entertaining. It is going to be dessert and not just their vegetables, right? And I think that is one of the things now where the expectation of voters is not to be reading about policy. So why would they be looking for it? And so I'm not really sure how you fix that. It feels like a scary road we've taken too far, and we're too far gone down it. But I have seen different organizations trying different things, at least around elections. But a place like Politico, we have offices in California, Georgia, we have people in Florida, we have people in Illinois. There are a lot of other states that I don't, I know all the states, but not everywhere we have an office.
We're quiz you tonight.
Yes. And so those are ways in which we can fix it, but we are not going to be able to fix the lack of local newspapers around this country. We are not going to be able to fix the lack of regional newspapers around this country. And I think that is a much larger problem than the headlines that are clickbaity. It is the fact that people don't have a reporter, because I started in local TV. And so you start to understand the community a lot better. And when you talk, you often see people out in the streets and they're kind of the same people over and over. And so they begin to trust you and they tell you things that they wouldn't tell a national reporter who's just popping in. You start to understand what their hopes and dreams are, what are the things that are going to drive them to vote, what are the things that are going to make them run for office possibly. And I think right before I go to a place, I often call some of the biggest local reporters to talk to them about who are the people I should be talking to. I don't know everything, and I'm okay with telling people that. Not everyone is, and utilizing them as a resource, but that is not what all of us are doing. And so, until media organizations can figure out a way to monetize the vegetable eating, we are going to continue down this road.
I love vegetables.
You're looking for a Greek salad.
No, a lot of great points. I think we were talking about this earlier about clickbaits and headlines, and the amount of times I've called a reporter mad about a story. Probably can fill a few of my kids' piggy banks. And I think part of this is, like it or not, the diversity of media, to have lots of different types of sources, which is good. But I get it. Like, news organizations are corporations, and I remember early on when social media became a big thing, a friend of mine who was a reporter saying how stressed out they were because no longer did they just have to write. They had to create social media content, they had to create their tweets, they had to create videos, they had to do all this other stuff. So they did not have time to do the stuff they wanted, the vegetables. They had to do stuff that would make money, that would bring in the clicks, because that's what their newsrooms wanted to do. So I don't know how you solve that. But there has to be a balance, and there has to be a decision, because I remember, Eugene and I were talking, like, when I first was in college, I wanted to be a journalist. And a lot of it is because you want to educate the public on, like, what is going on in the world, and this noble cause. I ended up doing political communications, but another kind of, but in many ways it's like try to educate the public on issues. But there's going to have to be some soul searching, just as we're talking a lot in the parties. There's going to have to be some soul searching in the media on how do you find that balance. Because I know a few times when I have wanted to do some more TV punditry, the direction I would get, it's like, you have to be, you need to throw more fireballs. You need to be bigger. You need to, this is how we get attention on these news stories. Like, they wanted big fire brands, not always like a balanced approach to stuff.
I think where you see this playing out a lot is particularly at the local level. Look, I don't think there's lack of resources in terms of covering President Biden or Donald Trump or these elections. But I do think when you're at the local level and you're thinking about your member of Congress or maybe the county executive or the county council, there was a time, 15, 20 years ago where there were reporters who were assigned, like that was their beat, That doesn't always exist anymore in some places. And so that hurts the public in terms of awareness, in terms of what is actually getting done on the city council or what's getting done on the county council or what is this member of Congress doing. And so I think that, as things have gotten like bigger at the national level in terms of having these, in terms of having, the Politicos of the world, CNNs of the world, where they have, where they have the ability to, cover these big important issues at a national level. I think at the local level, I think that's where you're getting, you're seeing the lack of journalists or the lack of resources for, local newspapers or radio stations to pay journalists to cover important things. I think that's where you're really seeing, an issue. And I'm not really quite sure how that gets fixed. In some ways you could say that, the ability for elected officials now to get their news out through social media platforms is maybe balancing that out a little bit. Because 15 years ago we were totally reliant on the local newspaper or the TV to pitch a story there. Now if no one bites, we can just tweet it out or put a video out and so we're not totally hacks are not totally dependent upon news journalists anymore. But at the same time, it would be nice if there were, if there were journalists who were covering these issues in a really detailed way, and I think the way they used to.
One of the things that when people ask me to talk to young journalists, which I'm still like, no, but I'm a young journalist. So like, no, you're not anymore. Come on, OD. And so when I talk to them, one of the questions they always ask me is like, these are people who are in their junior and senior years, like, okay, so how do I work at Politico next? And I'm like, no, you don't skip it. Don't skip around. Go to, and the advice I always give them, like, go and cover city council. Like one of the things, go and cover the county board of elections and sit in those meetings for 6 hours where you have people who live around the community coming and talking about potholes and complaining because their neighbor's tree is too far over the fence line and someone has to fix, like those kinds of conversations. One, they look very similar to how Congress works now, but they also give you a skill set. And we were talking about this yesterday when we were walking. Like journalism is a skill set. You don't have to have a journalism degree to be a reporter, but you have to have and find a skill set in order to do it. And so when you have people who don't want to go into local news and go into local reporting because, one, there's no money in it. That is absolutely true. It is hard to eat. It is hard to pay rent. And so they want to go ahead and go to a place where they make money. I get that. But then you lose the ability to cover some of these policy issues, some of these really important issues, what source cultivation looks like, having access to the mayor of the city. Like the mayor of Colorado Springs, he was just like knew who all the reporters were, and you can't really beat that, right? You can't really beat having access to people in that way, and so a lack of so much money at the top, a lack of the money on the bottom has created a world in which the young journalists and those that are watching go and work in local television, go and work in local news because it is better for this country and it will eventually be better for the reporters and then the news organizations that they end up, because then you have reporters who fully think about the work that they're doing and what it's saying to the world and what our actual goal is as reporters, which is often just simply to talk to really smart people and tell other really smart people what they said, right? Like that is at the end of the day kind of the job. And I think my hope is that a lot of these fellowships that are popping up around the country, a lot of these paid internships, folks, are giving young folks some hope that that working 20 years at the local paper is still a good job they should want, because that gives the rest of us the ability to, focus on the stuff up here, but then all of the things that the most Americans are actually seeing on the ground level are done by people who understand the community and aren't just trying to get people to click.
Just one real quick thing on that. That advice, which is spot on, is also the same advice I give to people about campaigns. Yeah, and they're like, well, hey, how can I get to SKDK? And I would say, go work in Iowa. If I hadn't worked in Iowa and learned how to do sort of your retail politics, I probably wouldn't be doing any of this stuff, and that's where I fell in love with campaigns, is at the local level. So it's the same thing, and you also get to know what voters care about, right? You don't get to know that, if you start your career out at the DCCC. I love the DTRIP and the DNC and all the committees. They're great. They play a role, but
yeah,
you got to be
combination.
Go out in the field.
So we've discussed many topics, and I know that we can go on for at least another hour. Tom, is that okay? But I think we're close to wrapping. So let me just say that this isn't the first time in history that our democracy has been challenged or tested. We talked about the Civil War, 1930s, during the Depression, World War I, World War II, civil rights, Bush Gore. But let me leave you with, while painful, do these events that test democracy only make us stronger? So let me also thank, the moderator is only as good as the panel, so she was okay. The panel was fantastic. Please join in thanking the panelists who did a fabulous job.